So I'm really excited to be here at Enigma as a social scientist because so many of you in your presentations referred back to human values in data. So let's talk about culture. And there's no better vantage point than the global cultural phenomenon that is TikTok. So this is a Chinese app that tops all of the lists of downloads and engagement. It's one of the most downloaded apps in over 40 countries. And you can see here that it's 15-second skits of lip syncing, dancing, tutorials, and it has a very young, highly engaged audience. You know, there's more young teenagers on TikTok in the US than on Facebook. So why are our legislators calling it a potential counterintelligence threat? The US government has opened a national security review into the acquisition of the American company that became TikTok. The Army and Marines have restricted its use. The app has 200 million users in India, where it was banned for a short time last year. So what is all this controversy about? And the answer is data. Now, data has been called the new oil or the jugular of the world economy, but we are programmed to see it differently. In the EU, it's about protection of the person behind that data. In the US, it's about liability, unintended consequences of acting on that data. In India, it's a public policy tool. In China, a national security tool. And in Russia, it's about the ideology behind the data. So there are human values at the core of all of these frameworks. And as data becomes tightly integrated in every aspect of our lives, data science is moving closer to social science. And this is critical in today's world, and I am going to show you why. Now, we also have risk as our data is transferred in between these different nation-state contexts with different cultural frameworks. So I'm going to go into the cultural dimensions behind these frameworks and look at the cultural elements in privacy and security, and then we'll go to some case studies and a call to action. So culture is that level of human programming in between what's universal to all of us, or human nature, and what is individual to us, our personality. It's a set of shared norms and beliefs and practices, and we all belong to many cultural groups: ethnic, religious, gender, geographic. Now, you here are probably really excited to be at Enigma with your people, speaking the same language, right? Because we as humans don't cooperate mindlessly. We specialize in our roles, and it's that culture that helps the group thrive and succeed in its environment. So I'm a cultural specialist, and this idea of cross-cultural communication or cultural intelligence is not a newfangled business concept. Since the 4th century BC, philosophers have been asking, how shall I talk of the sea to the frog if it's never left its pond? So I've lived, worked, studied in 9 different countries, 9 different ponds, developing emerging markets for consumer products companies and banks. And I'm also a linguist. And language is how we navigate the world. This is critical today in a post-digital era where our digital spaces are our spaces, and cybersecurity is security. So culture is a collective programming of the mind. What we see as beautiful, or visionary, or intelligent depends on our cultural framework. And it's not just what we see. It's how we apologize across cultures in a data breach, or what information we deem to be private in our culture. So anthropologists say that we all face the same universal problems or tasks, but it's the approach that each group takes that becomes the dimensions through which we filter that experience. So there are hundreds of cultural dimensions. Let's look at just one, which is the idea of individualism or collectivism. So the US is the most individualistic country in the world. From very early on, we raise our kids to believe in individual achievement and personal recognition. This is where we get our CEO culture and our entrepreneurial spirit. But most of the world operates under collectivist values of long-term trust and relationships and of shared goals and priorities. So when we navigate the web or process data or frame our policies, we do this through these cultural frameworks. Individualists will seek information independently from objective third-party sources versus relying on their groups or influencers. And we in the US have task-based relationships, kind of disposable around the task at hand, be it a product or a project or a conference, versus longer-term generational or trust-based relationships. And we take a monochronic approach to time. So very clear deadlines and milestones. It's almost like time is a litmus test for responsibility in our culture. And my clients go crazy for missed deadlines and late arrivals to meetings in other cultures. We need to step back and think many of these collectivist cultures have a longer view of time than we have in the US history. So a lot of time behind, a lot of time in front. It's not necessarily an expiring resource. So think of it as like a balloon that inflates or deflates according to the topic necessary. So it's actually a more sophisticated view of time, more of an agile approach. So if culture is how we frame our interaction and our understanding, then language is how we process it. And language is a soft power in the digital world. So if you look at this chart, this is Wikipedia translations between languages. You see English there firmly at the center, framing ideas and biases as that information flows through people speaking English. So this is why China, through Baidu, has its own collaborative encyclopedia. And Russia has announced an investment in a Russian Wikipedia to avoid the Western biases of Wikipedia. So this is essentially a rejection of the Western colonization of the digital space. And we'll take a look at that in our case studies. So if the original idea of the internet was this utopian view of sharing information across cultures, when it came to the privacy and security behind that data, things started to get a little bit more complicated. So cybersecurity is global by nature. But we're using domestic security measures to tackle global problems and looking at these problems through national lenses with domestic legal tools. And as transnational interactions become the new normal, it's hard to pinpoint what is that contextual legal environment? Who has jurisdiction? And now the idea of privacy is a cultural construct. It's not a deep primal need like human connection, and it's a young value. So the first definition in 1813 and case law only started to emerge around ideas of privacy in the early 1900s. And if we look about how much we're talking about privacy, we're only starting to really wrap our minds around this. When we saw Microsoft's timeline of explicit privacy initiatives, the timeline started in the year 2000. And here we can see across languages, whether it's English, German, Spanish, that we only started to talk about privacy in the middle last century. And this is relevant because theories of linguistic relativity inform that our perception of the world is shaped through the language we have, and vice versa. So if we're not talking about it, we're not developing ideas around it. And the ideas are very different. So in the EU, privacy is tied back to the dignity of the person. Privacy is a fundamental right in the EU Charter. Countries like Germany have a historical cultural affinity for privacy, very different than, say, China or Russia, where privacy is literally a foreign concept. In Japan, it's about accountability and transparency, not about regulation. And in US, it's industry specific. What is the purpose of that data and that privacy, like HIPAA? And in China, privacy is secondary to the collective values of the state. Now, we usually frame privacy from an individualistic perspective. But remember those collectivist cultures. They take a shared view towards the idea of privacy. So they negotiate privacy as a group. Now, Aboukir and Aidar, in their study of social media use in the Middle East, demonstrated how Arabs don't see their online personalities as reflecting themselves as an individual, but as part of the larger familiar groups to which they belong. And when they took a look at discussions on Twitter of privacy in Arabic, most often these translated back to honor. So the idea of honor is an entrenched cultural value in collectivist societies, especially Arab cultures. And the idea of honor is really a group dynamic, not an individual one. And we see this across all languages too. The nuances of how we translate this can be different. So if you ask a bilingual Russian how they would translate privacy, they may struggle a bit, because there never really was much privacy in Russia. It's not part of the vernacular. And we see this in Chinese and across other languages. So even what we determine to be private to us depends on our culture. So is your home address private information? 82% of people in Poland say yes, it is. But only 32% of people in Finland. And we see similar discrepancies across even the EU on financial information, your mobile phone number, search history. So if we don't have a universal understanding of what is private, how can we expect a global GDPR or universal privacy and security regulations? So now let's take a look at some case studies. So as technology and globalization have leveled borders, nations are reinstating these borders through tools for digital sovereignty. And many of these are complicit with digital colonialism and digital authoritarianism. So why is 5G a geopolitical issue? China's military academy talks about a military struggle in the cyber domain. The US fears that Huawei equipment could be used by the Chinese government to spy on American networks. So the US put together an entity list. China responded with the announcement of an unreliable list. And these moves are drawing the battle lines through data and technology. Last week at Davos, Yuval Harari said, when you have enough data, you don't need to send soldiers. So the idea of national sovereignty is becoming just as much about data as it is about land. And there's many tools that nations use to reinstate those borders that have been broken down by the free use of technology. So we just saw in December, Russia shut down access to the internet for 24 hours to test its national intranet. And we've seen total internet shutdowns in certain regions of India and Iran over the last few weeks in the context of political protests. So firewalls are one of these tools to reinstate these borders. And it's not just the Great Firewall of China. There's firewalls all over the world. I just got back from Dubai. And in the UAE, there's no VoIP. So no FaceTime, no Skype, no WhatsApp, no VPNs. So the local alternative is ToeTalk. Now, nothing to do with TikTok, except for the fact that they are both accused as being tools for surveillance. So when the New York Times came out with an investigation calling ToeTalk an Emirati spy tool, the App Store and Google Play took the app down. And Google's only recently, kind of very quietly, reinstated it. So it's really interesting how it's the New York Times, Google, and Apple drawing the battle lines in geopolitics. And the EU also is testing national borders in a whole new way. So the EU laws on hate speech have been applied extraterritorially. There was a recent case of an Austrian politician who sued Facebook to expunge comments calling her a lousy traitor and a fascist. And Facebook was required to remove these comments, not just in the EU, but worldwide. So very different than the idea of right to be forgotten, which so far has only held up within EU borders. So another tool to bring back this sovereignty in a digital form is data localization. So the Russian Data Protection Authority has stated that any website aimed at the territory of Russia or dealing in rubles needs to store its data in Russia. And China's cybersecurity law stipulates that all sensitive data be kept within China. And India's central bank requires all payment operators to store the data of Indians in India. Although as a couple days ago, it looks like this may be being relaxed a bit. So all of these are examples of digital protectionism. every concept we've had prior in history is just taking another digital form. This can actually increase cybersecurity risks as we get these kind of honeypots of data entirely within national jurisdictions. So some of these initiatives are labeled as digital colonialism, as the powers of the world use technology to assert control in the global south. This is a map of undersea cables, previously the domain of telecoms, now an arms race between Google and Huawei. So we're all familiar with China's Brick and Road initiative. This would be an example of what's called the digital Silk Road. But to see how pervasive this is, take a look at Cuba. So this is a country with very little at stake. 11 million people, one undersea cable out to Venezuela, where all the data goes through. I was lucky to go here a couple times last year for a project for an international client, and I saw Huawei everywhere. Russia Telecom is following, and Google has a memorandum of understanding for connectivity. So this is what the recolonization of the global south looks like in a digital age. Now, I know you in this room are all familiar with facial recognition, the controversies behind digital surveillance, but for this to get dangerous, you need a compulsory national ID program. The US doesn't have a compulsory ID program. Most countries do, and increasingly these are going biometric. So India's Aadhaar has 99% of Indians registered in what is the largest biometric database in the world. Alisem in France is following with the same paradigm. And there's many biometric data programs for identity throughout the EU, even Iraq, Cape Verde have these programs. And increasingly, we are beginning to fear that these are being used as tools for social manipulation. So we hear a lot of Big Brother stories about China and access to transportation based on your social history, crazy stories about pet etiquette and people in their pajamas being monitored. But in the US, we have social credit systems. We have credit scores. We have legacy admissions to universities. Many of you probably came here in preferential classes of travel or lines based on your loyalty programs. So it's important to look at these social paradigms through a cultural lens. So what next? What do we do? Cybersecurity calls for cyberdiplomacy. We heard yesterday about we need a lexicon, even around encryption, a common lexicon. And we've gone over some of these terms today, but they're very nuanced. Is smart technology really surveillance technology? Is that what we mean? And in the US, we're behind on developing roles behind this. We have big tech running the show, as we saw in geopolitics, but other nations like the UAE has a Minister of State for Digital Intelligence. Denmark has the world's first tech ambassador, and many countries are following. And France has a Secretary of State for the digital sector. So in our world today, we are learning how to coexist in these new digital spaces that have very quickly replaced our community pubs and summits with world leaders down to tweets of policy by world leaders, and all communication taking place within digital forums. We have big tech in the US, big tech in China, and the EU in between with all the regulatory framework, but with not much to regulate. So this is a world where free speech and privacy are in constant conflict with surveillance, where 5G is a geopolitical issue, where undersea cables are remapping the digital infrastructure, and where world leaders and tech leaders are getting into debates over hacking each other's cell phones. So if we know that data is valuable, whether or not it's the new oil or the new currency, we as a society need to develop privacy standards around that data. We need to either assign it economic value and compensate the data principals, or decide that it's a human right, tradable for no value. And on the business and tech side, we need standards of interoperability, data coalitions with common language, common standards, common values. And we need risk management tools. You know, when I was a banker in Chile, we could create any risk product to protect our clients against, say, price fluctuations in copper. And multinationals hedge all kinds of currency and commodity risks. But until we have these tools for data, the human values that are at the core of all of this digital behavior can't prevail in multilateralism. So it's our culture and our values that help us and protect us in our environment. And if you'd like to hear more about this, I'm on Twitter at @BecauseCulture, and I am really excited to see what kind of questions you have. So thanks so much for your time.